Welcome to the Lessons of Vietnam show with our new time slot and our new date. Our last show, by the way, was talking about the fall of Saigon. Today, we're going to be doing the finishing up of the fall of Saigon, and our next show will go into what happened after the fall of Saigon. But I am your host, Bill Dixon. The show is Lessons of Vietnam, where we try to tell the truth about the things that went on in Vietnam. There's so many myths, lies, and half truths out there that it's hard to get all on. We're brought to you on the second Monday each month at 3 p.m. by Nissan Communications. Without Amnon Nissan and giving us the time, we wouldn't be on the air. He pushes all the buttons and turns the knobs. If you'd like to see some of the archive shows, go to www.nissancommunications.com. Select on demand and select any show that's on there from the Lessons of Vietnam list or the LOV list. I am, as I mentioned before, your host, Bill Dixon, Vietnam 67-68, Tet survivor. I was in headquarters company, 159 Engineer Group, 20th Engineer Brigade at Long Bend. We value your information, comments and suggestions and just whatever. If you want to send me an email at dixonbill80@yahoo. You can, I'll email you back or give me your phone number or whatever. And just tell me what you want to do. But even better, during the show, if you have a comment, I want to be part of the show, hear something that you don't feel is quite right and want it corrected, just dial us at 919-518-9773. Again, that's 919-518-9773. Or even better, go to Skype. And the address there is Computers 2K Voice. That's Computers 2K Voice. All right, let's get into the show, and we'll talk about the. When we do that, we want to do something that's always important: the Veterans Crisis Line. The Veteran Crisis Line connects veterans in crisis and their families and friends with qualified, caring Department of Veterans Affairs responders through a confidential, toll-free hotline, online chat, or text. So, families or veterans out there and you need to talk to someone, dial 1-800-273-8255 and be sure to press 1. That gets you to a veteran. You can go online and chat or whatever. Okay, now I'm picking up where we left off before. There's been a lot of conversation. I have repeated it myself that the reason the war ended the way it was that Congress cut off all funds to South Vietnam, which is not quite true, but there's a little bit of blame on several groups' part. But congressional aid cuts didn't determine the war's outcome. Saigon's fate was sealed long before when Nixon forced it to accept his settlement terms in January 1973. In other words, that's when we started pulling out. As for Laird, claims of Congress cut off funds for Saigon has just never happened. Even Nixon acknowledged that the 1975 military appropriations for Saigon was $700 million. Nevertheless, Laird wrote in Foreign Affairs, he was Secretary of Defense for Nixon at that time, Foreign Affairs of the day in 1975 when Congress cut off U.S. funding. If only his editors asked him what day that was exactly that it happened. The imaginary of cutoff has made a real impact. In recent years, as the nation has debated withdrawing U.S. soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan, the cutoff that never happened was treated as fact by politicians, pundits, and press alike. Newt Gingrich in 1975, when there was no Americans left in Vietnam, the left wing of the Democratic Party killed the government of South Vietnam, cut off all of its funding, cut off all of its ammunition, and sent a signal to the world that the United States had abandoned its allies. That was a popular belief, but we just found out that there was money sent, maybe not enough, but there was money sent. Columnist Robert Novak says, Congress ended the Vietnam War with a communist victory by cutting off funds to South Vietnam. U.S. News and World Report says, historians say congressional Democrats dug themselves into a deep hole when they forced the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam and cut off money to the Saigon government as it struggled against the communists. And the question is, what historians? Which one says that? Laird's cutoff myth just embellished a bigger, more powerful myth begun by his old boss. Nixon claimed that as of the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973, he had won the Vietnam War. But in the years to come, Nixon contended Congress snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Congress snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Political spin Nixon crafted this secret strategy to foster the illusion that his public strategy of Vietnamization and negotiations worked. We'll get a little bit more into some of the background stuff in a minute. Vietnamization was supposed to train the South Vietnamese army to defend itself so the American army could come home. Negotiations were supposed to produce a settlement guaranteed to South Vietnam's right to choose its own government by election. Nixon privately realized that Vietnamization and negotiations would not work as he said they would. South Vietnam probably can never even survive anyway, he said in a private but never in public. To conceal Vietnamization's failure, Nixon timed the withdrawal of his U.S. forces to 1972 elections. This way, California Governor Ronald Reagan could welcome delegates to the Republican National Convention in 1972 with the perfect words to launch the president's re-election campaign. The last American combat team is on its way home from Vietnam. Of course, I'm certain got in some votes. To get the North Vietnamese to accept a settlement that, on paper, guaranteed the South's right to free election, Nixon assured them through the Soviet Union and China that if they waited for a decent interval of a year or two before taking over South Vietnam, he would not intervene. Now, right there is probably one of the most important sentences we're going to be talking about. Nixon assured North Vietnam through the Soviet Union and China that if they waited a decent interval of a year or two before taking over South Vietnam, he would not intervene. In other words, he knew they were going to take it over, and he promised not to do anything about it if they waited a little bit to make him look good. The communists accepted Nixon's settlement terms because they knew that they didn't have to abide by them, and they would get a clear shot at overthrowing the South Vietnamese government if they waited approximately 18 months after Nixon withdrew the last U.S. ground forces. Nixon wanted this decent interval to make it look like Saigon's fall wasn't his fault. You remember? Peace with honor. Nixon himself started the myth that Congress lost the Vietnam War to conceal the fact that he lost it himself. In reality, the agreement was little more than a face-saving gesture by the U.S. government. Even before the last American troops departed on March 29th, the communists violated the ceasefire, and by early 1974, full-scale war had resumed. War was the United States. At the end of 1974, South Vietnamese authorities reported that 80,000 of their soldiers and civilians had been killed in fighting during the year, making it the costliest year of the Vietnam War. By 1974, several factors led to the demise of South Vietnam. The Arab-Israeli War of 1973 triggered an economic crisis with rising inflation and soaring petroleum prices, causing problems all over the world, and more significantly angered American consumers. Not like today. The political environment of America had changed drastically. President Richard Nixon resigned from office in August of 1974, and the American people were becoming increasingly vocal against continuing aid for a war that felt had ended in 1973. Eventually, Congress bowed to the pressure and significantly cut Vietnam's military and financial aid. Faced with a money shortage and high inflation, South Vietnam was suddenly unable to purchase the weapons necessary to engage the North Vietnamese army. During this time of crisis, North Vietnamese secretly planned a major offensive meant to push deeply into South Vietnam's territory in early 1975. Now, as the United States had cut back on the supply, China and Russia just speeded us up more to the North Vietnamese. To make sure that the United States would not re-enter the war, The communists fell out the United States government by a series of small-scale attacks in South Vietnam. They'd come across and attack a small area, and the United States didn't come in and do anything. They got bigger and bigger until they finally got real bold. When there was no response from the U.S., they escalated their attacks. A lot of the South Vietnamese officers deserted their posts, causing a lack of leadership for the troops and resulted in mass hysteria in many of the South Vietnamese military units. A lot of the leaders of the South Vietnamese military, their family bought that position. They had no training themselves for the military. So when it got tough, they kind of just disappeared. In January of 1975, Phu Long fell to the communists. The South Vietnamese government had always believed that if the North Vietnamese violated the terms of the Paris Peace Accords, the Americans would return with force to help them. And why wouldn't they? Because Richard Nixon gave him his word that he would come in. South Vietnam's President Thu requested more U.S. aid to help regain the lost territory. Unfortunately for South Vietnam, massive American aid was not coming. Congress sent a delegation to Vietnam to judge the situation. They did recommend an immediate increase in aid to South Vietnam, but the situation continued to deteriorate. It became apparent that South Vietnam could not survive much longer. The fall of Ban Thuot on March 10th affected the situation in two distinct ways. First, Paul Struharak, excuse me, I have to spell his name there, the U.S. Darlik province representative. Darlik was a province. He was representative for them, along with several American missionaries, were captured in a defeat. Second, several Vietnamese employees of Air America were captured and executed by the North Vietnamese. As you can see there, where the different things are, you see Da Nang up there, Pleiku, Kon Tum there. We're going to be there, Saigon. We're going to be, let's see, I'm trying to see where the first one was. Phu Long, you see Phu Long there going up there. That's where the first attack was, which is way south of Saigon, down in the Delta area, and Ban Thuot and Darlik province. You can see up there. It was Saigon. So they were attacking all around Saigon, taking different places. And you can see the people there, the civilians trying to escape, but didn't have any place to escape to. The captured American, combined with the ARVN losses, convinced Congress to deny further aid to South Vietnam and to urge the Americans remaining in country to plan to leave Vietnam. The execution sparked a mass panic across South Vietnam, causing both civilians and military personnel to flee in the face of the Communist Army, often before a shot was even fired. As the panic continued, Thu, fearing for his own safety, pulled the elite airborne rangers out of I Corps and 2 Corps, which was I Corps was right up at the DMZ, and then under that was 2 Corps, which was the Central Highlands. He'd take all the good soldiers from there and move them down to Saigon to defend the capital and him. These actions destabilized the situation in the northern provinces of South Vietnam and allowed the North Vietnamese to take I Corps and 2 Corps, virtually unopposed. He wanted to make sure he protected himself more than his country. On March 15th, Pleiku, Kon Tum, and Darlik province in the Central Highlands were abandoned by the senior military officers, leaving the civilians and remaining ARVN troops to find their own way to safety. Many of them walked south to Nha Trang, most without any weapons or supplies for the journey, while communist troops continued to harass the fleeing refugees with rockets and mortars. The remaining ARVN troops defended the convoy to the best of their abilities, but 30,000 to 40,000 people were killed or died of starvation during the 15-day retreat. The press dubbed this event the Convoy of Tears. As March continued, Da Nang became choked with almost 1 million refugees and leaderless soldiers. Looting and panic rocked the city until the final evacuation on March 26th, 27th, 28th. It's kind of fluid there with that date. The Americans airlifted their personnel out of Da Nang and tried to evacuate as many of the Vietnamese workers as possible, but many were left behind. Ed Daly of World Airlines flew a mission out of Saigon to the airfield of Da Nang in an effort to save more people. The first off of his planes to land was mobbed so badly that it almost did not take off. You see everybody trying to get on the plane, they're closing their doors. The pilot had to reach to tell others not to land because it was too dangerous. Desperate people began filling boats in the harbor in an effort to escape the city, and many left with nothing but the clothes on their back. By the time the boats arrived at Cameron Bay on April 1st, many refugees had died of thirst. Americans watched their television with horror and anger as cities and towns with names they were familiar with from either their service in Vietnam or previous news. They were once again featured on the evening news, dinner time. One by one, the South Vietnamese cities began to fall to the North Vietnamese. Quy Nhon, Nha Trang on April 1st, Cam Ranh on April 3rd, Pham Rang on April 15th, and Phan Thiet on April 19th. The political situation in Saigon rapidly deteriorated, and the North Vietnamese government made it clear they would not negotiate with President Thu. On April 21st, Thu resigned. The president, with the hopes of his successor, would be able to negotiate better surrender terms with Hanoi. Over the next week, the presidency changed hands twice, finally settling on General Long Van Minh, also known as Big Minh. On April 29th, the North Vietnamese established positions outside the city and began shelling Tan Son Nhut Air Base. 24 hours later, the last of the Americans had left, and North Vietnamese came streaming into the city. You can see them there coming in. Now, on April 29th, 1975, shortly after 11 a.m., the American radio station network began to broadcast a pre-recorded message that the temperature in Saigon is 105 degrees and rising, followed by a 30-second excerpt from the song White Christmas. This signals the start of Operation Frequent Wind, the emergency evacuation of Saigon. American personnel began converging on more than a dozen assembly points throughout the city. The North Vietnamese had made Tan Son Nhut Airport unusable. It bound up the runway so much. Over the next 24 hours, the largest helicopter evacuation in history occurred when 7,000 American and South Vietnamese were evacuated from the U.S. Embassy and annexed in Saigon. 24 hours, they flew out 7,000 men and women and children. The following morning, North Vietnamese troops entered downtown Saigon, and the South Vietnamese government surrenders unconditionally. Kind of get the idea that the NVA North Vietnamese waited until the last Americans before they went in. They didn't want to make sure they didn't kill Americans. A new national constitution was adopted by the Communist Party of Vietnam, the CPV. And on July 2nd, 1976, North and South Vietnam were officially unified in name only. The new nation is formally called the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The Communist Party of Vietnam set about purging elements of the Old South. Its first target were South Vietnamese army officers and soldiers who were ordered to register and report for reform and retraining. Many were killed or sent to notorious re-education camps, where they were later joined by former civil servants, capitalists, Catholic priests, and other representatives of the old order. Even if you were a Viet Cong, if you were a nationalist and were more interested in having Vietnam as a free, a lot of the former Viet Cong were also sent. Camp inmates were given no criminal charge, trial, or sentence. How many Vietnamese died in the re-edu camps? Estimates ranging from 50,000 to 200,000. By 1982, 7 years after the reunification of Vietnam, around 120,000 people were still reportedly being detained. Remembering the final 24 hours of the fall of Saigon by Ronald Yates. Ronald Yates was a reporter who was in Saigon when it fell, and I thought he had some great information here. Ronald Yates lived the fall of Saigon in Saigon, and the following are excerpts from his outstanding work as a follow-up to, you may want to read some of his other books. This is what he had to say. I was in a place called Saigon as it fell to Communist North Vietnamese troops. is a day I will never forget, not only because I wasn't sure if I would get out of Vietnam in one piece, but because I still considered it one of the greatest betrayals in American history. Thousands of Vietnamese who had worked for and with the United States in an effort to keep South Vietnam from being conquered and assimilated by the Communist North Vietnamese were left behind as Americans abandoned them to concentration camps and worse. I was the Chicago Tribune's Far Eastern correspondent based in Tokyo, and I had gone to South Vietnam and Cambodia to report on both countries 2 years after the Paris Peace Accords were signed. I think that would be 1973. I am sharing with you my account of that harrowing, panic-filled 24-hour period between April 29th and 30th, 1975, when a 10-year-long war that some have called America's longest crusade came to a frantic and disgraceful end. During that frenzied final days, 1,373 Americans, 5,680 Vietnamese, and an exhausted and ailing American ambassador with the American flag folded under one arm and his pet poodle on the other would flee a land infamous for its coup d'etats, its stunningly beautiful and soaring green hills, lush forests, vast rubber plantations, and fertile rice paddies that had become a political and military swamp for several American presidents. Most Americans have subsequently concluded that what was then the longest war in the nation's history was also the first war Americans ever lost. However, as a former North Vietnamese colonel told me several years ago, one of the great ironies of Vietnam is that the American military was never defeated in any battle of any consequences. This is what the colonel had to say. You lost the war in the cities and villages of America, not the battlefields of Vietnam. Colonel Ba Trang, political commissar of the Saigon Special Action Unit, or BC, told me we could never hope for a military victory against such a formidable foe. Australia would survive to make the war last so long that you Americans would eventually retire and go home. That is what happened. We divided you politically and sapped your will to fight a war in a country few Americans had ever heard of or cared about. That's from the North Vietnamese. Indeed, while the specter of Vietnam still haunts us today, in the 1960s and 1970s, it divided the nation like nothing since the Civil War. In some ways, it continues to do so. The phrases, no more Vietnams, boy, have we all heard that one, adorns placards at nearly every demonstration against any U.S. military involvement, and one even hears reference to the light at the end of the tunnel. The phrase used in the 1960s by former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara to describe U.S. progress towards winning the war in Vietnam. The light was always to be seen at the end of the tunnel. McNamara's pet phrase was far from my mind 45 years ago when a barrage of 122 millimeter rockets slammed into Saigon. It was a little after 4 a.m. on April 29, 1975. I was jolted awake in my second floor room of Saigon's 4-story French colonial era, the Continental Palace. I remember going by that and taking a picture. It was beautiful on the outside. As I sat upright in my bed, I realized it was oppressive hot, and after the initial explosions, strangely quiet. There was no electricity. The North Vietnamese had hit one of Saigon's power plants, a common occurrence during the past few weeks. It lit one of the dozen or so. I lit one of the dozens or so candles, always kept ready and looked up at the ceiling. The gecko lizards had stopped chasing after mosquitoes and were retreating down the walls. Cockroaches the size of credit cards were scampering into the cracks of the ruby floor tiles. Even the rat that regularly patrolled my room was gone. They were all seen as smarter than he was. I wondered if what I had heard had been thunder. April 28th had been a day of thunderstorms with lightning flashing all over the city. Then a few moments later, the unmistakable metallic sound of a 122 millimeter rocket shrieked through the thick, humid night air and exploded nearby. This time, chunks of ancient plaster fell from the ceiling and the walls of the 100-year-old hotel shuddered. There's a picture of a 122 millimeter rocket. That is an American soldier carrying it. You ought to see the Vietnamese because it's bigger than they are. That was not thunder. These were the first rockets to hit Saigon since April 27th, when one slammed to the roof of the majestic hotel overlooking the Saigon River a few blocks away. Got a picture of that one. The hotel, not when it hit. Killing a hotel porter. Later that same morning, another rocket smashed into Saigon's bustling Ben Thanh market, killing more than a dozen people. I'm surprised that if it hit there, it didn't kill a whole lot more because that usually place is packed, even today. Jumping from the bed, I scampered barefoot over the cold crimson tiles to the small balcony overlooking Lamson Square and threw open the French windows. Before me, looming in all of its hulking majesty, was the old National Assembly building, and beyond it, the high-rise Caravel Hotel. Both were intact. To my right were Leroy Street, bisected Tudor Street. Several members of the South Vietnamese Home Guard, with red rosettes in their buttonholes, identified them as loyalists, were firing the old M1 carbines. For the past several weeks, Home Guard troops, who were mostly teenagers, had patrolled the streets by day, and at night had slept on sidewalks wrapped in ponchos. As I looked down on the Home Guard, bullets buzzed through the dark night air and ricocheted off nearby buildings. I ducked as several rounds slammed into the white facade of the hotel. During the past several months, I had gotten to know several of these Home Guard militia. Their job was to enforce Saigon's nighttime curfew. I paid them to escort me after the curfew to the public telephone and telegraph office so I could telex my stories back to the Chicago Tribune. "What are you shooting at?" I yelled. "VC beaucoup." "VC. VC. Beaucoup VC. Lot." A 17-year-old named Na shouted back. "Where?" "They're everywhere. You better hide." Then Na, who was usually wasted on Vietnamese 33 beer by this time, shrieked with laughter. "Quang, quang, quang, dong." "It doesn't matter." He's basically what he was saying. "It don't matter. We kill all number 10 VC." I remember thinking, if you don't kill everybody else in the city first, Na had lifted his rifle and fired several more rounds into the air. I had seen Na in action with his M1 carbine during after-curfew hikes to the PT building. He often amused himself by blasting away at the giant rats that roamed Saigon's deserted streets after the cyclones and ancient smoke-belching Renault taxis had stopped running for the night. I retreated into my room. In the distance, there were more heavy explosions. What sounded like 80 millimeter mortar rounds and 133 millimeter rounds, heavy artillery hitting Tan Son Nhut. Remember, that's the airbase. Saigon's main airport, some 7 miles away, the temperature was already approaching 90 degrees as I got dressed, and the sun wasn't even up. I decided to forego what would have been a cold shower. I needed to get downstairs and see what was going on. Was this it? I can recall thinking, is this the end? As it turned out, America's disastrous crusade in Vietnam was indeed over. And this was the way it would end. Not with honor, as one president has suggested, but in disgrace and humiliation and chaos. Even though the city was now under a 24-hour curfew for much of the final days, some 20,000 terrified, shrieking Vietnamese, many of them former U.S. government employees, would surround the American embassy, pleading with Marine guards to allow them inside the 10-foot walls. They could board the choppers that would take them to the armada of 44 American ships waiting off the Vietnamese coast. You see the embassy wall and the people climbing it. Some wouldn't make it over the walls. Excuse me, let me start that over again. Can't read my own stuff. Some would make it over the walls and onto the helicopter, but only a few. Most would be held at bay by U.S. soldiers, former allies, who pointed M16s at them, cursed them, pounded their clawing fingers with rifle butts, and threatened to blow their heads off. I can still hear the voices of American embassy officials and their Vietnamese interpreters shouting, "No one will be left behind. No one will be left behind." at the frantic throng outside the embassy, compound. It was a scene that still saddens me today, one that made me ashamed to be an American, not because we were leaving in abject defeat, but because we were betraying thousands, if not millions, of Vietnamese who believed our promises of a free and better Vietnam if they supported our policies. This is coming from the reporter. The North Vietnamese push for Saigon began March 7th in Vietnam's central highlands. 4 days later, the province capital city of Ban Ma Thuot, 180 miles north of Saigon, fell. A few days later, after the South Vietnamese president and Thuot decided to adopt a plan of strategic withdrawal, which in effect conceded the northern half of South Vietnam to the communists and gave rise to one of the greatest routs in the military history. As you can see there at the bottom, they're pushing excess helicopters over so there'll be more room for others. The lady there in the middle, where the South Vietnamese soldiers were taking off their uniforms and throwing them down and stealing clothes. And as you can see, the people getting on the boats, trying to get out of every way they thought possible. By early April, the North Vietnamese controlled almost 75% of South Vietnam, and a noticeable sense of doom enveloped Saigon. The city's ubiquitous bars, famous for the Saigon tea, were mostly empty. Vendors selling pho and beef noodle soup and white coffee. Beggars and hundreds of homeless children had all retreated from the streets. While these were ominous signs, I knew the end was near when the Indian tailor on Tudor Street, where I had gotten shirts made and changed dollars into Vietnamese piastres, began producing North Vietnamese and Viet Cong flags instead of American and South Vietnamese banners. That'd be a good sign. The official length of the war is generally conceded to have been 8 years. From 1965, when President Lyndon B. Johnson sent the U.S. Marines, to 1973, when the Paris Peace Accord was signed. However, if you count the first advisor sent to Vietnam by Harry Truman in 1950, America's involvement in Southeast Asia spanned 3 decades. During that time, about 3.1 million military personnel, including 7,200 women, served in Vietnam. The human toll was staggering. By the time America's active involvement in the war officially ended in 1973, it had claimed the lives of 58,183 Americans, men and women. Another 304,000 Americans came home wounded, sometimes physically and sometimes mentally. 1 of every 10 soldiers who served in Vietnam was a casualty. 105 journalists died covering the war, more than any other conflict in world history. Several are still missing. That is a reporter, Dickie Chappelle. She was killed out on a patrol. The lieutenant in front of her stepped on a mine who actually got her. Vietnam was nothing if not intense. For example, Pentagon figures show that the average infantryman in the Pacific Theater in World War II saw about 40 days of actual combat in 4 years. 4 years, 40 days of actual combat. In Vietnam, the average infantryman saw about 240 days of combat in 1 year. A fact directly attributable to the helicopter, which allowed for much more rapid deployment of troops. Then there were the MIAs, the 2,211 Americans still unaccounted for in Southeast Asia, including 1,651 in Vietnam. That number is not much lower today. The dollar cost of the war, more than $165 billion, which includes the loss of 3,689 fixed-wing aircraft, 4,857 helicopters, and 15 million tons of ammunition. The impact of America's involvement in the war was even more conspicuous. 3 million Vietnamese killed, including 1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers. 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers and 2 million civilians, according to the Vietnam's Ministry of Labor. War influence and social affairs. More than 600,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops were wounded. 500,000 South Vietnamese troops were wounded, and 2 million civilians on both sides were crippled by mines, artillery fire, chemical defoliants, bombings, and the general mayhem of war. Even today, the Vietnamese are still killed or maimed by unexploded ordnance and the defoliant residue, Agent Orange, Agent Blue, and so forth. Ronald Yates reports in early April, I had driven my rented Jeep to a town called Phu Hep and found myself in the middle of a rice paddy along with a handful of other reporters when a firefight broke out between ARVN, South Vietnamese, and North Vietnamese troops. We broke into a wild run across a large expanse of dry paddies towards a hamlet, and we heard the telltale thump of a mortar shell being fired. Eat dirt, someone yelled, and we plunged in a mass into a 3-foot deep irrigation ditch. Seconds later, an ear-splitting explosion sent the huge chunks of dirt and rock flying through the air and on top of us. We were fully exposed in the middle of a 10-acre chain of rice paddies. The nearest cover was a small river about 300 yards away. We thought about dashing it, but small arms fire from both sides kept us pinned down. We remained there in the muddy ditch for what seemed like hours as bullets kicked up the dirt all around us. In fact, the battle lasted only about 15 minutes. When the shooting subsided, we scampered towards the river, zigzagging and zagging as we went. When we got there, we paid some farmer who had taken cover along the riverbank to ferry us to the other side of their wooden dugout canoes. You can see Saigon there, and you can see Phu Hep down there. Again, I'll give you an idea again, which was down in the Delta. Once there, we met with the aftermath of the battle. The bodies of perhaps 15 invaded soldiers were strewn across the field. They had walked into an ambush. I was making a few notes and photographing the scene when several children from the nearby village emerged and began stripping the soldiers of any valuables they had, watches, rings, and shoes. Others were amusing themselves by jumping back and forth over the wire cable that connected several anti-personnel Claymore mines to a triggering device. And I would say probably the kids were also selling coats, what usually happens after a firefight. One touch and the mines could have killed 6 or 7 children and anybody else standing within the effective range. When detonated, Claymore, that's a Claymore you see in the picture, sends some 700 steel balls flying in a 6-degree horizontal arc at the height of 6 feet, over radius of 300 feet. I wrote in my notebook, the war and its instruments of destruction had become a daily amusement park. The kids had gotten used to it. On April 20th, the provincial capital of Swan Lock, just 46 miles of Saigon, fell after holding out for several days against a tenacious siege of NVA troops. The fall of Swan Lock was a signal for people to proclaim what quickly became Saigon's epitaph. It also sped up the dynamic Saigon rumor mill. One rumor said that the Catholics originally from the north would be sent on a death march along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Another story said the Viet Cong soldiers in Da Nang had ripped out the manicured fingernails of prostitutes, prompting a frenzy of fingernail cutting and polish removing along Saigon's bar girls. Yet another rumor said that unmarried Catholic girls would be forced to marry North Vietnamese war invalids. Amazing how the rumor mill works. The rumors had one cumulative effect. They tended to support the growing belief that the war was near an end. Since early April, several of us had pressed the U.S. Embassy for details of the evacuation, with no results. U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin was intent on not creating a panic by discussing the possibility of American exodus. Until the last day of the war, he had held out hope that a negotiated end of hostilities could be worked out. Indeed, 2 days before he had gone on Vietnamese television and announced, I, the American ambassador, am not going to run away in the middle of the night. Any of you can come to my house and see for yourself that I have not packed my bags. I give you my word. Martin had nevertheless sanctioned a low-key evacuation of Vietnamese and Americans called Operation Talon Vice. 2 weeks before April 30th, Operation Talon Vice evacuated 37,000 Vietnamese employees of the U.S. government and their families from Tan Son Nhut to Clark Air Base in the Philippines. Far short of the several 100,000 Vietnamese who had worked with the American Military Assistance Command in some way and who ultimately would be consigned to horrific re-education camps by the communist conquerors, in some cases for 10 years or more. To ensure that Talon Vice went smoothly, Martin authorized bribes to Saigon police so buses could be moved through checkpoints without a problem. He also allowed Vietnamese to be smuggled into the American embassy through a hole cut into the wall of the adjacent French embassy. Ambassador Martin did not want to be accused of cutting and running. Until the last hours, he was convinced there could have been some negotiations, equitable settlement that would allow a smooth transition of power. It is possible today to forgive Martin for his muddled thinking, especially in light of the revelations contained in the book, In Retrospect. The Tragedy and Lessons of Vietnam, published in 1995 by one of the architects of America's involvement in Vietnam, former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. He pushed the war, he pushed the war, he pushed the war, and knew it couldn't be won, or felt it couldn't be won. McNamara's admission that he and others in the Kennedy and Johnson administration knew the war was wrong and even unwinnable as far back as 1965, but decided to send Americans to fight and die there anyway, makes Martin's diplomatic dithering seem acceptable innocuous. Finally, on April 26, with 16 NVA Army divisions converging on the capital from every direction, a unique evacuation code was revealed by the United States Embassy that would alert us when the evacuation was imminent. And the 16 NVA divisions with 700 Soviet tanks coming down the road. The code, which would be played over a local U.S.-operated FM station, would be this: a short announcement that said, the temperature is 105 degrees and rising, followed by the first 8 bars of the song, White Christmas. April 29th dawned, and several of us huddled in the lobby of the Continental Hotel, listening to the portable UHF receiving an embassy official had given to the American Press Corps. Over the time receiver, we could hear radio traffic between the U.S. Marine contingent charged with guarding the Falcon complex of U.S. Defense Attaché Office, building near Tan Son Nhut, which they call the Pentagon East. The radio crackled with a running commentary from the Marine unit assigned to the building as one artillery shell after another slammed to the Tan Son Nhut and American compound. The back end of the gym is being hit, a Marine shouted into the radio. Roger that, Whiskey Joe, came the monotone reply from the embassy, which was appropriately code named Dodge City. My God, control, we've got 2 Marines KIAs. We talked about that last show. The last 2 Marines killed at Tan Son Nhut. Where are the bodies? Asked a voice from the embassy. They're right here. What should we do with them? You can see the base, the Tan Son Nhut Air Base get hit. Then there was a tremendous explosion amplified by the small radio. Jesus, the ammo dump's just been hit. All hell has broken loose out here. A few hours later, Operation Frequent Wind, then given to the final evacuation, was ordered by President Gerald Ford. And I paid one last visit to my room of the Continental Palace. I had stockpiled a couple of cases of American beer, soft drinks, and a variety of PX junk food, along with a small library of pirated books. I found Mr. Fan, one of the elderly hotel concierge staffers who slept in a small room on the second floor, sweeping my room as if nothing had happened. For almost 2 months, Mr. Fan, who had always appeared in clean white cotton pants and jacket, had cleaned my room, kept me a fresh bottle of water, and occasionally sprayed my room in a futile gesture of ridding it of roaches and other critters of the night. I pressed a wad of Vietnamese piastres, you can see one there, into his hand. Then it occurred to me that the money would be worthless in a few hours. Indeed, as far as Saigon's ambiguous money changers were concerned, piastres had been worthless for the past 2 weeks. I had about $500 in cash, and I peeled off $300 and gave it to him. Here, this may come in handy, Mr. Pham, I said, and please take anything you want from my room. I suggested he might want to get out of central Saigon and find a safe place until fighting an artillery barrage stopped. He smiled, bowed ever so slightly, and announced, "Thank you, but not to worry. I am VC." But that got his silences working. Many of us had suspected for some time that a lot of the boys, as Mr. Pham and his co-workers at the Continental Hotel were called, were probably Viet Cong or VC sympathizers. One reason, as many journalists stayed at the old hotel, was that we had heard that the owner paid war taxes to the Viet Cong so it would not be targeted for attack. As we shook hands, he looked up and said, "Why don't you stay? Everything will be okay here. Much better if you stay here." I explained that the Tribune had ordered me to leave and that I had a baby daughter I hadn't seen in almost 4 months. He nodded. Yes, maybe you go now. It was the last time I would ever see Pham, who was in his 70s at the time. When I returned in 1985 for the 10th anniversary of the war's end, the staff at the Continental Palace informed me he had passed away in 1982. By 10 a.m., a small army of American, European, and Asian correspondents lugging typewriters, sound equipment, suitcases, and shoulder bags left the Continental in a small, silent file. We had been told to make our way to a point 6 blocks away near the Saigon River. As we trudged down Tudor Street, armored soldiers and home guard units watched our ragtag formation menacingly. In the distance, we could hear the constant explosions of artillery and mortar shells as they slammed to the city's suburbs. Finally, we arrived at our evacuation point, a spot facing a statue of Vietnam's 6th century military hero, Phan Hung Dao. A helipad had been created atop the building, but the South Vietnamese Navy had placed a 50 caliber machine gun on the top of the building next door. It was decided that the machine gun might be used against departing U.S. choppers, so that evacuation point was abandoned. I made my way to the U.S. Embassy, thinking that might be an option for changing a copper out. It was surrounded by thousands of furious Vietnamese demanding to be let inside the embassy compound. There was no way I was going to push my way through that mob. Finally, there we go. Next one. I trudged down the Hai Trung Street. I knew I didn't come close on that one. The temperature was already close to 100 degrees and my shirt was soaked through with sweat. Eventually, I made my way to an alternate evacuation point, University of Maryland Saigon Education Center. It was padlocked. I waited. Finally, at 12:20, 2 olive drab buses arrived and I climbed aboard along with about 60 other members of the Saigon Press Corps. The 2 buses then began an aimless voyage through Saigon. Every few blocks, the bus would stop and the Marine would assign to our bus would ask for instructions on his 2-way radio. "What's this, the Graham Martin sightseeing excursion?" someone asked. UHF radio in the Marine's hand cracked. It was Dodge City again. "We're in trouble here," the voice said. "There are 20,000 people at the front gate of the embassy. It's getting hostile." "What should I do with my bus?" our Marine driver shouted into his radio. "Looks like Tonsanut's your best option, your only option," came the reply. "Don't come here." "Roger that," the Marine said. Then, turning to the 60 people jammed on the bus, he said, "Looks like we're going to the airport." In the distance, we could hear the explosions of rockets and mortar shells slamming into Tonsanut. As the bus approached the main gate of the airbase, we could see black pillars of smoke rising from the runway. Then the Vietnamese guards at the gate began firing the M16s in our direction. We dove for the floor. Our Marine escort, codenamed Wagon Master, yelled into his radio for instructions. "This looks bad. What should we do? What is the situation at MACV headquarters?" "It ain't good," the radio cracked. "We're taking lots of mortars and artillery fire. Bust through the gate if necessary and then drive like hell." The radio crackled, and as an afterthought, his voice said, "Good luck." I seriously considered getting off the bus and walked the 7 or 8 miles back to the city. Before I could, the driver moved the bus back 100 yards from the gate. "This is it," he yelled. "Keep low. We're busting through the gate." He stopped on the accelerator and the bus lurched forward. As we bore down on the gate about 60 miles an hour, we expected the guards to start shooting. Instead, they inexplicably backed off and opened the gate seconds before the lumbering vehicle would have rammed through them. Off to one side, a down the Huey helicopter with one skid broken off lay on its side with its motor running and its tail rotor still spinning. We watched a Vietnamese C-119 transport plane somehow lift off from the cratered runway, and we applauded the pilot's skill. Our applause turned to horror seconds later when a heat-seeking missile streaked skyward, slammed into the transport, and sent it into plummeting towards what looked like the Sholon section of Saigon. The Sholon section was the Chinese section. It makes you want to get on an airplane, doesn't it? As we moved along up to the MACV headquarters compound, a 122 millimeter rocket punched into the Air America terminal just across the street, showering us with debris. I was in the back of the bus trying frantically to get the locked emergency rear door open, when another artillery shell exploded a few hundred feet away, pelting the area with shrapnel and breaking several windows on the bus. By this point, I was on my back, kicking with all my strength at the door. Finally, I managed to kick the door open. I slid down to the ground and waited for a few minutes using the bus as cover. Most of the press corps had already made it into the building. I took a deep breath, then began my sprint over the 50 feet of open ground to the DAO building. Another rocket slammed to the roads a few yards behind me. I dove to the ground and flattened myself on the hot concrete. I could hear razor-sharp metal shrapnel slicing through the air behind me. A few seconds later, I pulled myself up and scuttled like a crab towards the door. Once inside, we crouched along interior hallways and waited. A couple of hours went by. Several Marines handed out paper bags and told us to write our names and next of kin on them and attach them to our clothing. These are for you, not your luggage, they said. I knew what they were. I had seen them before, attached to the bodies of battle casualties. Outside, a constant deluge of rockets, mortars, and artillery shells rained on Tonsanut and Dao compound. I closed my eyes and actually managed a few minutes of sleep between explosions. You can sleep anywhere. It was almost 6 p.m., some 14 hours since the final bombardment of Saigon had begun. I was exhausted. I was sure every ounce of adrenaline in my body was used up. I thought about the C-119 I had watched get knocked out of the sky by a SAM-7 missile and began to wonder if I had made the right choice. Maybe I should have stayed after all. During one of the Saturday's briefings at the Viet Cong compound at Tonsanut, which was established as part of the 1973 peace accords, Colonel Ba had told me all correspondents would be treated as guests by the conquering North Vietnamese army. We're not barbarians like the Khmer Rouge, Colonel Ba said, referring to the news of the carnage in Phnom Penh that was beginning to filter in Saigon. Just remain in your hotel room and someone will come for you. Those who earn an honest living will be welcome. Of course, I had not remained in my hotel room. I was inside the Dao Bell compound, more than 7 miles from the Continental Palace Hotel. How would I go back to the city center? Catch a ride on NVA T-54 tank? Hardly. The shelling outside intensified. The huge Dao building trembled as one artillery shell after another slammed into the compound. I was on the verge of getting up and walking back to central Saigon when a Marine captain walked into the corridor and bellowed, "Okay, this is it. We're moving out. Didi Mao," which means go. We spilled out of the Dao building. Two Sikorsky CH-53 Sea Stallion helicopters were waiting on a tennis court about 300 feet away. Their blades whooshing slowly into hot, sticky air. After what seemed like an eternity, I and about 80 others scrambled on the rear loading ramp, hunkered on the floor, and canvas beach seats. Seconds later, the loadmaster raised the ramp and we lifted off. We flew low at first. Then the pilot put the helicopter into a steady climb. I stood up and looked down at Saigon over the door gunner's shoulder. The city seemed bizarrely peaceful and idyllic, with the Saigon River meandering through the city and towards the South China Sea some 50 miles away. 40 minutes later, we were landing on the deck of the USS Denver at a landing platform dock, about 35 miles off the coast of Vung Tau. For the next several hours, we watched one helicopter after another arrive. Some of the unauthorized South Vietnamese Army helicopters were allowed to land and then were pushed over the side into the sea. Eventually, with the ship's decks filled, Vietnamese pilots were no longer allowed to land. So they fly their heroes to within 100 yards of the ship, open the doors, and jump into the sea along with their passengers. The choppers would remain in flight for a few moments and then pitch into the ocean, sometimes dangerously close to those swimming towards our ships. At 4:58 a.m., April 30th, Ambassador Martin closed down the embassy, destroyed its communication equipment, and climbed aboard the helicopter of the embassy roof. The helicopter pilot sent a message to the fleet. Lady H09, code 2 is aboard. Lady H09 was the chopper's call sign. Code 2 was the designation for an ambassador. At 7:52 a.m., the last chopper lifted off the roof of the U.S. Embassy, carrying out the small detachment of Marines who had guarded the embassy compound and engaged terrified Vietnamese in running floor by floor holding action through the April 29th and early 30th. As the last Huey lifted off, the pilot radioed the final official U.S. message from Saigon. Swift 22 is airborne with 11 passengers. Ground security force is aboard. Then the radio cracked again. Bye-bye, Vietnam, a voice said. Bye-bye for now. The end, but not the end of the war. 2 weeks after the fall of Saigon, on May 12, 1975, at Khmer Rouge, Cambodian patrol boats seized the U.S. merchant ship SS Marquez and its crew in Cambodia waters. President Ford was challenged by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, belief that the ship's seizure provided an opportunity for the United States to prove that others will be worse off if they tackle us, trying to save face, and not that they can return to the status quo. It's not enough to get the ship released, one Pentagon official told Newsweek at the time. Henry Kissinger was determined to give the Khmer Rouge a bloody nose. You see the map there, right off of Vietnam, the arrow, and then the island. So it's right off of Vietnam, the island of Koh Tang, which was part of the Cambodian property. U.S. ship attacked seized by Cambodia, New Stars and Stripes. 3 days later, 8 helicopters carrying almost 200 Marines left Thailand for Cambodia, Koh Tang Island, where they believed the ship's crew was being held. Minutes before the first helicopter landed, Ford received word that the Cambodians had released the ship and its crew. The president and his chief of staff engaged whoops of joy. Wrote Newsweek at the time, Henry Kissinger beamed ear to ear, a lot of them celebrating what seemed at that midnight time to be a famous victory. U.S. Marines stormed the ship in Koh Tang Island where officials believed the Marquez crew had been held. 41 service members lost their lives in the Battle of the Island and associated air operations. There were 31 sailors to be rescued. But the Marquez crew members were not on the island or their ship. Cambodian forces released them just as U.S. military operations got underway. And they were safely recovered by the USS Wilson. I have you the picture here of Lance Corporal Joseph Hargrove from Mount Olive, North Carolina, PFC Gary Hall, and Private Danny Marshall. Those are the 3 Marines that were left on the island and were never allowed to go back and get. We've done several shows on Joseph. There's some more information coming out, so we'll be doing another show before too long. But those 3 Marines were left on the island, and the Marines nor the SEALs were allowed to get back to them. Okay, our next show will be the Lessons of Vietnam show will be the 14th of June at 3 o'clock. We hope you enjoyed this show, and if you would like to view a show that you missed, just log on demand at www.nissan.com/archives, PHP, and select your show. Please tell your friends about our new date and time, the second Monday of each month at 3 o'clock. We were, as you know, in the evenings, so we have changed the time to better reach more people, and so I can get more time to do the shows. It's got to the point now I've done so many shows, and it's so important that we get the real information out, and it's causing me to have to do a whole lot more research. So give me the opportunity that we've gone to one show. I hope you enjoyed today's show. Tell all your friends about us. Our new time slot, as I said, go into the archives and see some of the old shows, especially the one if you missed the last show. We talked about the fall of Saigon. I hope you have a great remainder of the week. Wherever you are, take care of yourself, look out for the COVID, and that's it. Good day.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.